Welcome to the Goal Podcast, news and commentary from Gun Owners Action League, your leading voice for the Massachusetts gun owner.
I'm Jeff, across the table from Garrett. It feels like it's been a while since we sat across the table and recorded.
You know, well, last time you were out at an undisclosed location somewhere on the eastern seaboard, and before that we had meetings and we had events and you're right, it does feel like it's been a little while. But here we are at the beginning of summer with all sorts of wonderful news from the Supreme Court.
Well, we finally have some decision or some movement on Snope v. Brown and Ocean State Tactical versus Rhode Island, which was a heck of a surprise for my Monday.
Yeah.
But Ocean State Tactical v. Rhode Island was denied certiorari by the Supreme Court this past Monday, June 2nd, 2025. No statements or dissents were published, except a note that Justices Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch would have granted cert, meaning apparently that Roberts, Barrett, Kavanaugh, and the revisionist justices voted against it. I mean, it was an interlocutory appeal for relief, so somewhat of a long shot given the history of the court anyway, which we've talked about for the last, couple of months watching this thing get kicked around. But it's clear the First Circuit's going to get its say before we, the people, get to yet again pay out of our own pockets to maybe, hopefully, get the opportunity to argue our civil rights should be respected as more than just a government-issued privilege.
And in keeping with that negative tradition, Snope v. Brown out of Maryland has also been denied cert after more than a dozen reschedulings throughout the term. June 2nd, 2025, same date as Ocean State Tactical. The denial was apparently 6-3, with Alito, Gorsuch, and Thomas saying that they would have granted cert. Roberts, Barrett, and Kavanaugh were apparently in the majority to deny, along with the, as you call them, revisionist justices. The thing that hurts about this, though, is Kavanaugh issued a statement respecting the denial of certiorari, meaning basically he's like, yeah, okay, I can see that.
Why?
Yeah, right. Just if you're going to, if you're going to deny cert, just deny cert. You don't have to make a thing out of it. But in his statement respecting the denial of certiorari, he agrees with obvious facts like AR-15s are owned by millions of Americans. They're legal in most states, which is 41 as of 2025. They're used for lawful purposes such as self-defense, among other things, target shooting, etc. And then he says that, yes, Heller says arms in common use are protected, but then he goes on to refuse to do anything about it. In this statement, he says, in essence, that the Supreme Court should wait because there are cases still pending in lower courts. Several circuits are still, kicking around appeals. And he says the Supreme Court will handle it, maybe later. The end of his statement was additional petitions for certiorari will likely be before this court shortly. And in my view, the court should and presumably will address the AR-15 issue soon, in the next term or two.
Which makes no sense. So he lays out all the reasons, right, 100% why these kind of laws are unconstitutional. Yeah. So it is a constitutional question. Yep. Then says that he believes that it will be likely and that the court should and presumably will address this anyway, but says that they shouldn't because, there are other cases that this would impact too? No. Well, yeah, there are going to be other cases that are impacted by your decisions. And that is not a good reason to not rule on a case because it might impact something else.
Yeah. Oh, it's so, yeah, no, you're right. His statement comes off like really weaselly and weak to me in quote, respecting the denial of cert. And the words that he used in his statement, he's like saying, it's like he's saying, yeah, this is probably unconstitutional. Maybe we'll deal with it in the next couple of years or not, comes off as pretty political to me. He agrees that the Fourth Circuit is probably wrong. He acknowledges the logic, the constitutional test, the common use argument, all of it. And then he walks away. He's trying to look like a defender of rights in his statement, but without doing anything that's politically risky. He's hiding behind the court's tradition of not getting into interlocutory appeals, and I get that because, like you said, we have discussed that many times. The Supreme Court doesn't like getting involved there. But this case, to me, just feels different. You know, Kavanaugh may think his statement signals some kind of warning to the Fourth Circuit, like, you better straighten up and fly right or we're going to get you. But they're not going to see it that way. They're going to see it as a win. They're not going to be afraid of it. They're going to see it as a win because it's completely toothless. I can't personally think of a more ripe example of a modern case where an interlocutory intervention by the Supreme Court would be more appropriate.
Yeah, it very much screams of trying to take the easy way out when, you know, often the case is that the difficult thing to do and the right thing to do are usually one and the same. So this kind of statement, you know, I think it makes you fearful that public pressure and intimidation tactics by the likes of, you know, Chuck Schumer saying, you know, you'll pay the price and you won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions are causing certain justices to put off their actual civic duties in the pursuit of a more, I don't know, favorable public image.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, to be fair to the guy, you know, from the minute he was nominated, he went through a very obviously and well orchestrated attempted character assassination, and then a very real attempted assassination following the leak of the Dobbs decision. But that's no excuse at an attempt to straddle this imaginary fence of, you know, and by extension, allow a half dozen states to continue to throw the finger at the U.S. Supreme Court and wipe their backsides with the Bill of Rights.
Exactly. The fact that he votes against this is pretty clear that he's okay with allowing that state of affairs to continue.
After making an extraordinarily logical and stepwise argument as to why they should absolutely take this case.
Yeah.
And to say, well, we're going to do it, but later. So we know your civil rights are being infringed. We know that we need to take this, but I don't feel like doing it right now.
It sounds like a lot of work.
I just, you know, I don't want to deal with you people to this term. It's like, come on, man.
Well, Justice Thomas, St. Thomas, issued a dissent from the court's decision with, I think, some pretty sharp language in it.
Yeah, the guy with the spine.
Yeah, right. The one guy that has a backbone. Thomas points out what really should be obvious under Heller, Catano, and Bruin, that AR-15s are clearly bearable arms under the Second Amendment. He goes on to say that the Fourth Circuit got it backward. The Fourth Circuit puts the burden on gun owners to prove that AR-15s are protected, whereas the burden should be on the government to prove that they're not protected. The government must prove that its law fits within text, history, and tradition. It's not, you know, up to the people to prove that it doesn't. Maryland failed at this miserably. Maryland is arguing that AR-15s are, quote, dangerous and unusual, right? That's the so-called legal standard. But he says that they can't be unusual when they're owned by millions of people. As far as dangerous goes, the exact same capabilities that Maryland claims make the AR-15 bannable are held by millions of other rifles lawfully owned and are not banned.
To the extent that they say that not having those other rifles banned justifies the AR-15 ban because you have alternate options.
Right. Yeah. No, exactly so. And he says, besides, under Catano, a gun may not be banned unless it is both dangerous and unusual. So if it's dangerous and not unusual, well, guess what? Too bad. It can't be, you know, can't be banned. His quote was, "Our Constitution allows the American people, not the government, to decide which weapons are useful for self-defense." And obviously, I agree wholeheartedly with that statement.
Yeah, the Fourth Circuit really turns this common use thing into a popularity contest and then completely ignores the overwhelming popularity of a specific patented design style of a firearm. So Thomas points out that under the recent Vanderstock ruling, the ATF could just label the AR-15 as a machine gun because it may be converted into one illegally. Gun owners are left to the goodwill of a federal agency, not law, to decide whether their guns are legal or not legal. And he ended by saying that the Supreme Court has avoided this topic for a decade. I mean, certainly since the federal assault weapons ban expired. It implies that if the Second Amendment wasn't considered a second-class right, which it obviously is being considered a second-class right in a lot of these circuit courts, that they would have jumped on it by now. It says, until we resolve whether the Second Amendment forecloses that possibility, law-abiding AR-15 owners must rely on the goodwill of federal agencies to retain their means of self-defense. That is no constitutional guarantee at all.
So, I mean, this is kind of where we're left. Both cases being denied means that Rhode Island's magazine ban and Maryland's AR-15 ban stay on the books for the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, it feels kind of like a gut punch to me. After months of watching these cases get relisted time and time again, right? Think finally that the Supreme Court might show some backbone. We're left here with nothing. The Supreme Court didn't just blink. They turned and looked the other way. It feels like, whether or not they intended it as a message, it sure as hell feels like one to me. Meanwhile, every time something like this happens, the states say, yay, we won, and they trip over themselves inventing new ways to pretend that the Second Amendment doesn't mean what it says.
Oh, it for sure will be viewed and touted by gun control activist organizations, not just as confirmation, but as encouragement that not only are they not violating the law, that they're doing the right thing and they should be encouraged to do more.
Right. Yeah.
They're going to say, hey, the Supreme Court upheld our ban.
Yeah. That's the way it's being put in the media. Some places kind of reasonable are saying, the Supreme Court declines to act on, but
or that the Supreme Court
usual suspects are like, oh yeah, this Maryland's ban is upheld and Rhode Island's ban is upheld.
Bans are constitutional when that's not really what they said, but that's what we're going to have to live with until, as Kavanaugh said, until they feel like getting around to. Yeah. Defending the nation's founding documents.
Till they can be, arsed to bother about the Constitution. Ridiculous. Not good stuff. But, I mean, on the slightly less dark side, there are other cases that are wending their way up through the circuit courts right now. And this season at the Supreme Court is over. They're not going to take anything new now. They're going to be done in a few weeks.
Best case scenario, it's next session.
Yeah, they'll start doing conferences again in September, October, or whenever the hell it is they come back, and then maybe we'll see some movement on one of these other cases. But who knows? I don't have a lot of confidence.
Well, it's already teed up to say when they said that it's going to be the next session or two.
Yeah, right. They've given themselves permission to blow us off for another couple of years. Last episode, we did a little bit of a deep dive into some concepts surrounding misinformation, disinformation.
Yeah. So as what Chapter 135 and that question is going to be on the ballot for 2026. Obviously, the recent Supreme Court decisions are going to be used to bolster the argument that Chapter 135 is perfectly constitutional. It is going to be used and say, hey, the Supreme Court upheld that what we're doing is perfectly kosher. But, last episode we talked about the myths and misinformation that's being propagated about school shootings, school violence. And the next one we wanted to cover is, and you've heard the claim up so many times, firearms are now the leading cause of death for children in the United States. It's emotionally powerful. It's designed to shock, and it conjures up this image of, the toddler, the adolescent, the 5-6-year-old climbing up on the shelf in dad's closet, pulling down the dusty shoebox to bring out the shiny revolver. And then, tragedy ensues. And, there's grieving parents and shattered families and calls to do something. And activists and political groups and politicians start clamoring for more restrictions, more bans. And if you oppose the new restrictions, it's you don't care about children, or your guns, your toys are more important than your kids' lives. And it's common sense, they say, to do what they tell you to do instead of slowing down and thinking about what just happened and coming up with an actual approach that's going to fix problems.
Not allowed to think, just do.
But the question is, are their solutions really common sense, or are they just saying that and redefining the term common sense to mean don't question what I'm about to tell you? The important thing is to think, is this image really the picture? Is this really what's happening? Like many things in the debate about firearms and regulations and control, when you look underneath the surface layer, when you open up the hood and look to see how the engine actually works, you see that their claims don't hold up the way they want you to think they do.
So where does that claim come from? The claim traces its roots to CDC mortality data, specifically from their Wonders database and the Whiskers system. If you go to CDC, the CDC's website, it's basically the two major search engines that they have. It's for tracking statistics. The numbers are publicly accessible. Go to CDC's website. You can see, they're out there for anybody to see. It's the interpretation that the numbers that bears looking at. Activist groups like Everytown and even some journals like the New England Journal of Medicine ran the numbers from these databases and started basically adjusting the input sliders. They ran a query for underlying cause of death by injury mechanism for ages 1 through 19. Sure enough, in recent years, firearms deaths seem to overtake motor vehicle accidents for that age group. In 2023, they reported 4,455 firearms deaths versus 3,890 deaths from car accidents in the same range, as long as you're using their search criteria. Begin the clutching of pearls, right? The headlines from the AP. Guns are now the #1 killer of children, ran the AP headline. Anti-gun groups and even the supposedly scientific journals, everybody just kind of ran with it. But there's a trick baked into that headline. Defining children as everyone over the age of 1 up to and through the age of 19 is a problem. And from a statistical standpoint, it's misleading.
Yeah, I mean, anybody that's taken a high school or college level stats class knows you can prove anything you want if you selectively,
if you play with the input.
Cherry pick the data that you want and exclude the data that you don't want.
Sure, you can get it to say anything you want. When you turn 18, you're an adult, okay? You can vote, you can serve in the military, you can be tried in court. When you're 18 and 19, you're also in the age group that is by far the most likely to be involved in the modern phenomena of organized or violent crime. Considering a 19-year-old career criminal a child for the sake of a gun violence stat is manipulative, and it's a distortion.
It's intentional, and it's intentional. They know what
They know what they're
doing.
Yeah.
And it cuts both ways. So infants under 1 year old are excluded from the data. And why? Because they're more likely to die from birth complications and genetic issues or non-injury causes. But they also die in car accidents and house fires. And now those deaths are not being counted by this cherry-picked data.
Right.
So that artificially lowers other numbers, making firearms look proportionately worse by comparison. So the framing here is really designed to look at the shiny object over here for the emotional response, and it is not an honest and fair analysis. So the real numbers. So over the last 5 years, among children under the age of 18,
actual children,
not legal adults,
right?
They found 586 firearm deaths were accidents, 3,637 were suicide, 7,096 were homicides, and the rest were either like law enforcement intervention, undetermined, no cause listed, I guess. So think about those numbers. More than 60% of all those firearms deaths for people under the age of 18 were homicides. The deliberate, someone choosing to harm another person. That's not a 5-year-old finding granddad's unsecured revolver. We're talking about murder.
Yeah.
Murders that are far and away more likely caused by older teens or young adults.
Right, who would not normally
and
be
by young adults, I mean 19, 20 to 21, 22, 25.
In other words, people that wouldn't be normally included in the cohort of children.
Yeah, who are involved in organized violent crime. In Massachusetts, there's, you can sort all the data, but in Massachusetts, there's around 100 murders per year committed by people using firearms. How many are committed by those under 18 years old? Fewer than 7. The numbers are so small. The CDC actually suppresses the data for further breakdown under the guise that because the numbers are so low, it creates this, like, you can personally identify who they're talking about.
Right. It's no longer just
it's no longer
just a sample.
An anonymous data set because the numbers are so small.
It's actual people now.
And then you look on the national scale, what's driving this is certain counties and cities, Chicago, LA, Memphis. So urban violence is real, but it's not affecting children the way that they're trying to make it seem.
Actual children. So what about accidents? I mean, accidents happen. They're an unfortunate feature of life. No matter what you're doing or how careful you are, accidents happen. But accidents with guns are thankfully also extremely rare. I don't care what the, Everytown and the rest of them say. It's really, really rare. When you're looking at data for children, guns don't even rate in the top 5. Drownings, car crashes, fires, poisonings, all of these rate higher. With an estimated 500 million guns in private ownership in the U.S., the odds that any one of them being involved in an accidental death is about 1 in 850,000. The odds of a child being killed in a car accident is more than 30 times higher than those odds. If you want to knock down the accident numbers even further, you turn to education, not legislation. One JAMA study demonstrates that showing kids a 60-second video on gun safety made them 3 times more likely to tell an adult if they found a gun, and significantly less likely to ever touch it at all. Are gun control groups like Everytown, etc., offering that kind of training? No, of course not. But groups like Gun Owners Action League, 4-H, NRA's Eddie Eagle program do it every day.
And they do it under the constant threat and pressure of these self-described, and I'll put the air quotes around it, safety advocates trying to shut firearms organizations out of the conversation or shut them down entirely.
Bill tells the story. Bill tells us the story all the time, right? He goes to the school with like this program. He's like, I'm going to teach it to the kids. Gun safety. It's all about, stop, don't look, don't touch, telling of all the whole thing. And he tells it to school. School's like, fabulous. This is great. Let's do this, until they look at the back cover of the book. And what do they see printed there?
National Rifle Association, Eddie the Eagle program.
Instantly, it's shut down. No, we can't possibly do that in school.
Because
so it's not about
optics.
safety. Right. Exactly. It's not about safety. It's about optics. Right.
And it was a very interesting study that group did, because what they did, they took hundreds of children and they said, at home, you show them a 60-second video, one on firearm safety, and then the control group was shown a video on, vehicle safety. It's something completely different. Later on, those children were brought into a controlled laboratory environment, and they were left to play in an area where there were functionally disabled firearms that were hidden in drawers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The kids who watched that video previously, not like they just watched it and then were presented with the option of a firearm.
Yeah, it was earlier.
60 seconds were significantly less likely to even touch the firearm.
There you go. Because it was implanted, right? The seed was planted that, hey, this is a bad thing and I shouldn't be farting around with it like the movies say it's okay to do.
So the whole idea that firearms should be this taboo thing and don't talk to it and don't present it to children, don't teach them reality versus fantasy, that's not acceptable. The scholarly sources that they love to cite to say that these things are such a problem are also saying that the best thing you can do that's actually effective is to teach your children some actual safety.
Exactly.
So when we look at, I guess I would say the bigger number issues. So if we're going to look at kind of the bigger picture numbers that are in these statistics, and it's a very, uncomfortable topic to talk about because it is so ingrained in tragedy. But self-harm and suicide accounts for more than 3,600 of those juvenile firearms deaths. That combined with asphyxiation is roughly 87% of all of these youths that are committing these self-harm acts. And it's awful, it's tragic, it's preventable, but the question that I ask and that I think we should be asking is why? Self-harm amongst teens and the rates of suicide has tripled since 1950. And that's up 40% since 2000. I mean, 40% is a huge number. And this is in the age of self-esteem, bullying awareness.
Right.
There's more access to therapy, mental health medication. More is known now about early intervention with mental health than ever. Allegedly, anyway.
Yeah.
So what's going wrong? And there is research out there, researchers like Dr. Peter Gray of Boston College, and they point to issues in modern childhood where they find that kids are not developing coping and social skills at a young age because they're, in his theory, overscheduled, overprotected. They don't have the resilience because anytime anything goes wrong, somebody else can just fix it for them. or they do fix it for them.
Yeah.
So growing up with that kind of shell around them doesn't allow them to develop the skills to handle when things are going to go wrong, which naturally happens in life. It was an old,
the kind of things that you have to deal with.
they say one of the only things that's fair in life is everybody gets screwed sooner or later.
Well, yeah, you have to be able to develop the coping skills in order to deal with that.
And understanding proportionality and what the real magnitude of certain problems are.
Right.
Now, Chapter 135 and similar laws don't do anything about this. They offer no funding for mental health, no funding for intervention, no funding for youth outreach. They focus solely on the tool being used to the exclusion of asking why that child decided to take that action in the first place. And when they talk about, intervention, they talk about red flag laws. You cannot red flag someone that does not have a firearms license.
That's right. What are you going to do?
And then even if you did, then what?
Yeah.
You're going to drag a teenager into court and say, we think you're a risk to yourself.
Go home.
See you later.
Yeah, right.
So when we're looking at, the questions and they say, this is for the children and this is for safety. Okay, what does this actually do for safety?
Does nothing. Let's bring it around to the biggest cause or the biggest share of firearms-related deaths among youth, homicides. Overwhelmingly, these are urban and suburban teenagers caught in violent cycles of drugs, poverty, and repeat offending. You remember that Holyoke bus shooting from last year? The one they used as emotional leverage all over the newspapers to push Chapter 135? They didn't tell you everything about the men charged in that incident.
Men, by the way. These are
right. Adult.
legal adults.
Charged in that incident, such as one of them was out on bail at the time. Another one of them was denied bail for evading capture and finally getting himself placed on the Mass State Police's most wanted list. And the third one had his bail revoked from an ongoing firearms case in the same district court.
Yeah, that particular guy is like assault and batteries, domestic violence, intimidation of witnesses, multiple unlawful possessions of firearms. And they're like, yeah.
Yeah, you can go.
Yeah, you're arrested, but
You're okay.
But come back when your court date is. Otherwise,
you're in trouble, mister. Yeah. Repeat felons with these long rap sheets are like the norm for this kind of criminal act. What does Chapter 135 in the Anti-Gun Activists say about it? Nothing. Nothing at all. They say that the tool is the problem and not the criminal.
By the time a criminal commits a homicide, or the average homicide suspect has been arrested on average 11 times prior with violent crimes and felonies included. So it's not like, there is the idea that someone with no criminal history all of a sudden takes an outrageous act.
Crime of passion goes nuts, but
that
that's
is the
norm.
exception. That is a very rare exception.
Yeah, that's not the norm. And it's leniency, right? It has to be.
Yeah, there is this bizarre pattern, like almost this fetishized view of career criminals.
This young man who's just trying to turn their lives around.
I don't understand it. And this was just recently, and this was a WCVB news story. Immigration and Customs Enforcement arrested and deported a guy, and not making any comment about what's going on with that or immigration policies or anything like that. Has nothing to do with it. How did they find him? Wouldn't have been hard because he was wearing an ankle monitor as part of his bail agreement after being indicted in December of last year. And his charges, 2 counts of aggravated rape of a child, possessing or posing a child in a sexual act, possession and distribution of child pornography, and disseminating obscene material to a child.
Jesus.
According to law enforcement, he had videos on his phone of himself raping children.
Jesus.
And out on bail, walking around in the neighborhood. He just had a curfew for the evenings. And these are some of, what they say are the most horrifying charges imaginable, and just walking around freely in public for months before federal authorities snatched him up. And now he's in the whole deportation thing. And the criticism from the state is, well, now he won't get his day in court for this charge as he's walking around enjoying his time. So that leniency isn't isolated to this one particular event. We see it repeatedly all the time. And in years past, they did the MA court fails.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Showing the revolving door that is Massachusetts judicial system.
Yep.
But the legislature here wants to keep piling on law after law to restrict the people who don't break the laws, but have this bizarre and weird tradition of taking actual violent criminals.
Yeah.
And just saying, oh,
turning them loose.
They're just misunderstood. What they need is
crazy.
I mean, it's
what they need is a little understanding.
It's hard to say, but I think it really shows where their priorities are. They would rather keep a violent criminal in your neighborhood to use that as justification to take away your rights than to just take that violent criminal out of your neighborhood.
Well said. Yeah, you're right. It really does show where the priorities are.
So when you hear the phrase that firearms the number one killer of children, we live in an era where then you have to ask, what do you mean by children? Are they talking about toddlers finding grandpa's gun like in the pictures they like to paint? Or are they talking about adult-aged career criminals killing each other over whatever nonsense they're into when they shouldn't have even been on the street in the first place?
Right. Never mind not having gun licenses or any of the rest of it,
Yeah. Is that stolen pistol registered? Did you know that that's illegal?
Fewer tragedies are born from actual solutions. We know what the solutions are. This is not, it's not rocket surgery, right? Yeah. We know what the solutions are, and they're not bans on law-abiding people. They are education, their accountability, mental health support, not red flag laws, because that's not mental health support, and targeted intervention on high-risk groups. It's not that difficult a concept to understand. Chapter 135 addresses none of the real drivers of gun-related tragedies. None of them. It wasn't written to prevent accidents. It doesn't invest in suicide prevention, offers no support for education, mental health, or violence intervention. Why? Because it wasn't written as, nor was it ever intended to be, a public safety bill. It was written by anti-gun special interests to serve gun control as a political objective. They say the bill will make us safer, but if it doesn't, and by design can't do any of the things that actually reduce gun fatalities, then what does it do?
Yeah, that's the question that more people need to ask. So if you have not already, go to www.goal.org, read the bill, and see for yourself what Chapter 135 is really about. There's a reason they have to use intentionally misleading information, padded statistics, and that's to get voters to stop thinking for themselves and start doing what they're told.
Yeah.
So if you care about real solutions, if you actually want to reduce the real numbers, and nobody's saying that the real numbers aren't tragic, then you need to get beyond the surface. You need to go deeper, past the bumper stickers, past the slogans, and you need to get involved with organizations that are actually doing the real things that are proven to have a positive effect. And it's sad that something as serious as children getting hurt or losing their lives is being treated this way by the likes of political pundits and activists. You don't need to falsify data and massage the numbers to make that point. And to my mind, doing so only proves that their intent is not genuine or benign. I mean, imagine if I said heart disease is the leading cause of death in children, and buried in, Appendix B in the back of the article, word 900 of the 1,000-word article. Yeah. I say, oh, yeah, by the way, I define children as anyone 65 and over.
You don't have to fudge the numbers and make basically false statements in order to point out that it's a tragedy. Everybody knows that it's a tragedy.
Yeah. And firearms owners are on the front line of trying to ensure that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
No firearms owner
more so than any of the rest of these groups
bought that firearm and took it home and go, I hope something happens to my children.
Right.
No one said that.
Of course not.
So that's where it comes around to. Chapter 135 is nothing more than political charlatans selling your constitutional civil rights for bumper sticker donation dollars.
It sounds cynical, but yeah, you're exactly right.
They say the thing and it makes them money. And they're not doing a damn thing about it. They know they're not doing anything about it, yet they get to punish the 14-year-old pheasant hunter who now can't go out with grandpa.
Yeah, they have access to the same data as we do, but they choose to manipulate that data in order to make their point instead of actually reflect reality. So before we go, we wanted to bring you a little piece to remind us all that we're not completely alone here. People in other states are seeing what's going on. People do support us. John Petrolino, the Penn Patriot, good friend of the Goal podcast, good friend of Goal. He sent us an article from News 2A. The article contains a letter from the CCRKBA, which is the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. The letter was penned by John Petrolino, the Penn Patriot, and sent by the CCRKBA to the Massachusetts EOPSS. That sounds like a lot of letters. Speaking out against...
We need the Department of Government Efficiency Department.
Speaking out against the live fire requirements called out in Chapter 135, and we thank John for doing so. The article says, the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms has taken direct action regarding proposed training mandates in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts by sending a letter to the Massachusetts Executive Office of Public Safety and Security, EOPSS, opposing the requirements. CCRKBA board member John Petrolino's letter reminds John H. Melander, the attorney at the EOPSS in Boston, that such training requirement is unlikely to pass constitutional muster. Sounded pretty clear to me. John's letter had some pretty strong language in it. Quote, while the debate at hand is not whether or not compulsory training is unconstitutional, rather the type of training that would satisfy a statutory requirement, it's important to preface our recommendation with our stance on the issue. On behalf of our members, we want to make it clear that we are not in favor of training mandates in order to exercise a constitutional right. Requiring training, live fire or otherwise, in order to purchase, own, or carry a firearm is akin to needing a college degree in order to express one's own opinion or practice their religion. There are no training mandates in order to exercise any other of the civil liberties enumerated by the U.S. Bill of Rights, and the Second Amendment should not be treated like a second-class right. That being said, please allow the following position statement of the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms to be entered into the record on what would be an appropriate live fire requirement to be met for firearms licensure in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Sounds pretty straightforward. I couldn't agree more. You can read John's full letter at news2a.com. Appreciate the support, man. John's a great friend of ours.
Yeah, and you can ask, and when they talk about live fire mandates, this is another perfect example of taking that one step beyond the bumper sticker.
Right.
To ask just the basic questions of what do you mean and what is the effect going to be? So what is the effect of live fire training? Because they like to say, well, if someone's going to have and carry a gun, shouldn't they have shot it before? The question I ask is, why? What is the issue you think you're resolving by having a live fire mandate? Does it stop accidents?
No, of course not.
No. Does it stop self-harm?
No.
Does it stop homicide?
The answer to the only one that might have even the most tiny bit of relevance there is the accident question, but we don't have an accident problem here in Massachusetts.
At best, it's statistically anomalous and it's unsupported. It's inconclusive at best.
Right. There is no evidence whatsoever to support the notion that live fire mandates for, licensed gun owners here in Massachusetts will decrease accidents. We have so few accidents, and frankly, we don't even know whether or not those people are licensed to begin with. So there's simply no justification for the idea that, live fire mandates would reduce accidents here.
So the question is what is live fire going to do, and how does the state plan to structure it in such a way that it is not only accomplishable, if that's even a word, and then what is the end result that they're looking for? Because we don't have a firearms accident issue in Massachusetts.
Right.
The one that I think, what do we have? 2 maybe? It's one of those situations where it could go from like 1 this year to 2 next year, and they would say the accident rate doubles.
Yeah, right.
We have asked time and time again, when there are accidental firearms deaths in the state of Massachusetts, were those firearms lawfully possessed or were they unlawfully possessed?
Yeah, we don't
the
know.
state has consistently refused to not only answer that question, but to even look at that question.
Of course not, because doing so wouldn't suit the narrative.
Even if it did, even if both of those firearms were perfectly lawfully possessed on a license, and you could even attempt to correlate, well, this person didn't take live fire training.
Right.
The overwhelming number of firearms owned in the state by the people who own them in the state, no accidents, no problems.
Yeah, no problem.
And that has nothing to do with live fire training. What are they doing? They don't offer training. They offer no funding for training. And when it comes to live fire, they're offering no real guidance on what to do, how to do it, where you're going to do it.
Yeah,
and they're offering no funding for it either.
They're just throwing down mandates and not following up with any actual.
So the question is, who's paying for this training? Where are they going to hold it? There aren't state ranges.
That's right. It's a constitutional takings issue. You cannot compel ranges and associations, clubs and associations to host this kind of stuff.
The very
what are they
real
going to do? They're going to build ranges. They're going to staff them. They're going to maintain them, insure them, all that stuff all the way across the state. And never mind providing transportation for people who don't drive, you know,
or people who don't have access to ranges. I mean, how many ranges are there within the public transit system of Boston? One?
Doesn't matter. They're private. If it's one or two, it doesn't matter. It's private. The government can't compel them to use their facilities for that purpose.
So the very real effect. So there's 180 and change private firearms clubs,
around 200,
somewhere in that range.
But the very major, majority of them all are pretty small.
Most, if not all of them, only allow their own folks to teach at their ranges.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of...
If they allow teaching at all.
If they allow teaching at all, if they allow non-members to shoot at their ranges for the purposes of licensing classes. So the effect of live fire training effectively removes any instructor who does not already have access to a private range that allows them to do live fire training at their disposal.
Basically. Yeah.
So the only effect of the live fire training mandate is going to reduce the number of instructors who can teach the course.
And that, my friend, is a feature, not a bug.
That's not an accident.
That's right. By design.
That's it for today. Thanks for listening in. Be sure to subscribe to the Gold Podcast and check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/Gold Podcast MA, on YouTube at the Gold Podcast, or on X, the app formerly known as Twitter, at Goal Update.
To join Goal, visit goal.org and click the Join or Renew buttons at the top of the home page.
If you have a topic you think we should cover, if there's something going on in your club or town, or if you have a question for the mailbag, shoot us an email, goalpodcast@goal.org.
The Goal Podcast is a production of Gun Owners Action League of Massachusetts. The views and opinions expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of Goal, its staff, or affiliates.